An old man's hand closes on empty air where his father's cane should be. 78 years old, and suddenly he can't trust his own legs to get him home. A biker crosses the sidewalk. The same man half this town crosses the street to avoid and crouches down low. Tell me what happened. Within an hour, 5 motorcycles are parked outside a diner, engines silent, 5 strangers in leather vests hunting for an old man's missing father. But the thief isn't who anyone expects. And what they find waiting behind that gas station will change more than one life on this quiet street. Starting with a secret a 17-year-old has been carrying completely alone. Robert Callahan had learned over 78 years that a man's world could shrink without him noticing it happen. It didn't collapse all at once. It thinned out quietly, the way frost creeps across a window until one morning the glass is white and you can no longer see through it at all. His world these days was the distance between his front porch on Larchwood Avenue and the corner booth at Millie's Diner, 4 blocks away. It was a walk he made every morning at 7:15, rain or shine, because the walk was his, and there were not many things left that still belonged only to him. Millbrook, Ohio was the kind of town where the water tower still had the high school's graduation year painted on it, 1974, faded now to a rust-colored ghost, and where most people knew Robert not by his name, but by his walk, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man, and his cane moving down Main Street like a metronome nobody had bothered to wind down. The cane was ashwood, dark with age, with a brass handle shaped like a duck's head. It had belonged to his father, and before that, according to family legend nobody could fully verify, to a grandfather who had carried it through a hard Ohio winter in 1938. Robert had inherited many things when his father passed. A modest house, a set of tools, a stubborn set of opinions about how a man should carry himself. But the cane was the only one he used every single day. He didn't need it, not really, not for walking. His knee had been rebuilt 11 years ago and worked fine on good days. What he needed it for was balance of a different kind. Since Eleanor died 3 winters ago, the cane had become something to hold on to that wasn't a phone that never rang or a chair across the table that stayed empty. His daughter, Carol, lived 2 states away in Michigan and called on Sundays, dutiful and loving and always a little rushed. His son had settled in Arizona and called less. Robert did not blame them. Life pulled people forward, and he understood that the forward direction did not always run through Millbrook, Ohio. What he had instead was routine. The walk to Millie's, the corner booth, the coffee poured before he asked. The same waitress, a woman named Patty Kowalski, who had worked there for 19 years, and knew he liked his eggs over medium and his toast dry. The short conversations with whoever else was up early enough to matter. Then the walk home, past the hardware store that used to be a 5 and dime, past the war memorial with his cousin's name on it, past the mechanic's garage on the corner of 5th and Union, where a group of motorcycles were often parked in a neat, gleaming row. He had passed that garage 1,000 times without much thought. It was owned by a man named Daniel Whitfield, a broad-shouldered veteran in his mid-40s, who Robert knew only the way you know a fixture of your own street. A nod exchanged most mornings, nothing more. Daniel ran the garage with 2 other men, and in the evenings a rotating handful of motorcycles gathered there, engines idling low, leather vests marked with a patch Robert had never bothered to read closely, an eagle over crossed wrenches, the words Iron Ridge MC stitched beneath it. People in Millbrook had opinions about the Iron Ridge Riders. Some called them a motorcycle gang, said it with a curled lip, the way you'd describe something you'd decided to be afraid of without ever asking why. Others knew better, knew that half of them were veterans, that they ran a toy drive every December that filled 2 truck beds outside the elementary school, that Daniel Whitfield himself had spent 11 years in the army before 2 tours changed the shape of what he wanted from a life. But opinions travel faster than facts in a small town, and most people who passed that garage crossed to the other side of the street without knowing why they did it. Robert never crossed the street. He had spent enough decades on this earth to stop being afraid of leather and loud engines. What he was afraid of, if he was honest with himself on the mornings when honesty came easier, was silence. The particular silence of a house built for two people now occupied by one. On the Tuesday that would end up changing everything, Robert woke to a grey sky threatening rain that never came. Dressed in the same brown cardigan he wore most mornings, and reached for the cane resting against the wall by the door. Exactly where it always rested, exactly where it had rested every night for 3 years. He made the walk to Millie's without incident, past the memorial, past the garage where Daniel Whitfield was already elbow-deep in an engine, and lifted 2 fingers in his usual silent greeting. Robert lifted 2 fingers back. It was, he thought later, an ordinary morning in every visible way, the kind of morning that gives no warning at all before it turns. He ate his eggs. He drank his coffee. He talked for a few minutes with old Frank Delgado about the Reds' bullpen, a conversation they'd had in some form or another for the better part of a decade. And when he stood to leave, setting $3 on the table the way he always did, he reached down for the cane he had leaned against the outside of the booth, his hand closed on nothing. For a moment he thought he'd simply misjudged the angle, that his fingers had missed by an inch, and he reached again, patted the space more carefully, looked down at the floor expecting to see the familiar brass duck-head handle catching the fluorescent light. The cane was gone. Robert stood very still in the aisle of Millie's diner for longer than he meant to, one hand braced against the booth's vinyl seat, feeling the particular helplessness of a man whose legs are perfectly capable of holding him up, but whose balance has been quietly, invisibly compromised anyway. "You all right, Robert?" Patty Kowalski asked, coming around with the coffee pot, her voice sharpening the way it did when something in a room felt wrong before she could name why. "My cane," Robert said, and heard his own voice come out smaller than he intended. It was right here. They looked together. Under the table, behind the napkin dispenser, along the floor by the register, out the front door, onto the sidewalk where the morning traffic of Millbrook moved past, with the particular indifference of people who did not yet know anything had happened. Patty asked the busboy, asked the 2 men at the counter, asked Frank Delgado, who looked as baffled as Robert felt. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had seen anyone leave carrying a cane that wasn't theirs. "Somebody must have grabbed it by mistake," Patty said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her own explanation any more than Robert did. A duckhead brass handle worn smooth by 70 years of hands was not the kind of thing a person mistook for their own. What Robert did not say, because it embarrassed him to say it out loud, was that the cane wasn't really about walking. That it was his father's hands and his grandfather's hard winter and 3 years of steadying himself against a grief that hadn't finished arriving. That losing it felt less like losing an object and more like losing a rope he hadn't realized he was still holding on to. "I'll call the police station," Patty offered, already moving toward the phone behind the counter. "Don't trouble yourself," Robert said, though it was less pride than exhaustion. He knew, the way anyone who has lived 78 years knows, that a missing wooden cane would rank somewhere below stray cats on the priorities of Millbrook's 4-officer police department. "I'll manage." He did not manage well. Without the cane, the 4 blocks home stretched out in front of him like a mile. He gripped the back of a chair, then the door frame, then made his way outside, leaning heavily on the diner's brick wall, testing each step with the particular caution of a man who has broken a hip once already and has no intention of doing it twice. It was there, on the sidewalk outside Millie's, moving slower than he had moved in years, that Daniel Whitfield found him. Daniel had come by for his own coffee, a habit as fixed as Robert's own, and pulled up short at the sight of the old man, half braced against the brick, his face pale with the effort of standing still. "Robert." Daniel crossed the sidewalk in 3 long strides, one hand out, not touching, just present, the way a person offers a hand to someone they're not sure wants to be touched. "What happened?" Robert almost waved him off. Almost said nothing. "I'm fine, don't trouble yourself," the same 3 words he'd said to Patty, but something about Daniel Whitfield's face, steady, unhurried, genuinely asking rather than performing concern, made the words come out different than he planned. "They took my cane," Robert said, and heard how strange it sounded, even as he said it. An old man whispering about a piece of wood to a stranger on a sidewalk. "Somebody took my cane." He watched something shift in Daniel's expression. Not pity, Robert would have bristled at pity, but a kind of focused attention, the look of a man recalibrating a problem he'd decided was now his to solve. "Let's get you sitting down first," Daniel said, and without making a production of it, he offered his arm, solid as a fence post, and walked Robert the half-block to the garage, where he set him in a folding chair beside the open bay door and brought him a bottle of water like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Now," Daniel said, crouching down so he was eye level, "tell me what this cane looked like." Robert described it. The ashwood, the brass duck handle, the small nick near the base where he'd once caught it in a car door, and watched Daniel Whitfield listen the way very few people listened anymore, without checking a phone, without waiting for his turn to speak. "That's not just a cane," Daniel said when Robert finished. It wasn't a question. "No," Robert admitted. "It was my father's." Daniel nodded slowly, and then he stood, walked to the garage's back wall and picked up a phone that hung on a cord older than some of the customers. He dialed a number from memory and said only a handful of words before hanging up. "Garage. Now, bring the others." Within 20 minutes, 4 motorcycles idled into the lot beside Daniel's garage. Robert watched them arrive with the wariness of habit, an old instinct he couldn't quite shake, even as he sat there having just been helped by the very man who owned all this leather and chrome. The riders swung off their bikes, a heavy-set man named Gary with a grey beard down to his chest, a wiry younger man called Miguel with an easy grin, a woman in her 50s named Ruth Ann, who moved like someone 20 years younger, and a quiet man in his 60s, everyone simply called Doc, who had, Robert would later learn, actually been a combat medic once. Daniel gathered them at the edge of the garage, spoke low for a minute, and Robert caught fragments: elderly man, cane, fathers, Main Street, somebody's going to make this right, and watched 4 strangers' faces change from curiosity to something firmer. "Mr. Callahan," Gary said, walking over and extending a hand, roughened by decades of engine grease, "we're going to find your cane." Robert looked at the 5 of them. Daniel, Gary, Miguel, Ruth Ann, Doc, 5 people whose leather vests he had crossed no streets to avoid, but had also never truly looked at, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly, the way a knot loosens when you finally stop pulling against it. "You don't have to do that," he said, out of habit more than conviction. "We know," Ruth Ann said simply. "We're doing it anyway." The search began that same afternoon, and it was, at first, entirely unglamorous. Doc walked the 4 blocks between Robert's house and Millie's diner twice, checking storm drains, the alley behind the hardware store, the dumpster corral behind the pharmacy, on the theory that whoever took the cane might have simply discarded it once they realized it wasn't worth anything to sell. Miguel went store to store along Main Street, asking shop owners if their security cameras, the handful that existed, might have caught something. Gary drove slowly up and down every side street within a half-mile radius, eyes scanning yards and porches, while Ruth Ann sat with Robert at his kitchen table, letting him talk, which turned out to be its own kind of searching. Robert told her about his father, a machinist who'd worked the same plant in Dayton for 31 years and carried the cane the last decade of his life after a workplace accident took the strength from his left leg. He told her about the winter of 1938 the family story insisted on, though he admitted he'd never been able to confirm it, and about Eleanor, who used to tease him gently that he loved that ugly old Kane more than he loved his good sense. She'd have found this whole thing very funny, Robert said, and for the first time in 3 years, the memory of Eleanor's laugh arrived without the accompanying weight of loss dragging it down. A grown man, half the town looking for a stick. "It's not about the stick," Ruth Ann said. "Never is." She said it plainly, without sentimentality, the way a person says something they've learned firsthand rather than read somewhere convenient, and Robert found himself wondering briefly what object or absence had taught her that particular truth. By evening, the search had turned up nothing, and Robert felt the particular deflation of hope raise too quickly. He sat on his porch as the sky purpled toward dusk, caneless, watching Larchwood Avenue empty of the day's small business, and told himself it was foolish to have let strangers on motorcycles rearrange their whole afternoon over an old man's walking stick. That was when Daniel Whitfield's truck pulled up to the curb, and Daniel climbed out looking, for the first time since Robert had met him that morning, genuinely frustrated. "We've got a lead, but it's not a clean one," Daniel said, settling onto the porch step without being invited, the way a man does when he's decided formality has become a waste of everyone's time. "One of the shop cameras caught someone matching a description near the diner around the time you noticed it missing. Teenager, maybe 17, 18. Miguel recognized the jacket he was wearing. Kid's name is Tyler Voss." Robert knew the Voss name vaguely. A family 2 streets over. A father who worked at the auto plant in the next county. A mother who'd left some years back, if memory served. "You think a kid stole an old man's cane?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "there might be more to it than theft. Gary talked to Tyler's neighbor. Boy's been in some trouble lately, and nothing violent, but enough that people have started keeping half an eye on him. Shoplifting mostly. Small stuff. The kind of small stuff that usually means something bigger's going on at home." Robert felt the story complicating in a direction he hadn't expected, the simple outline of "someone stole from me" smudging into something with more shadow in it, more history he didn't have access to. Rain had finally started to fall outside, a thin grey drizzle that beaded on the porch railing and darkened the sidewalk in patches. And Robert found himself thinking of all the mornings he'd made his walk to Millie's in weather worse than this. Cane tapping out its steady rhythm against the wet concrete, and how strange it felt now to sit still while other people did the searching for him. "You don't have to worry about the cost of gas or time," Daniel added, as if reading the shape of Robert's silence. "Nobody out there tonight is doing this because they owe you something. We're doing it because it's Tuesday, and Tuesday's as good a day as any to fix something that's broken." "So what happens now?" Robert asked. "Now," Daniel said, "we go talk to him. Not to scare him, just to talk." Robert almost said no. Every instinct built over 78 years told him that confronting a troubled teenager with 5 leather-clad strangers, however good their intentions, was a recipe for making things worse rather than better. But something in Daniel's face, a steadiness Robert had come to recognize over the course of one long day, made him nod instead. "I'm coming too," Robert said. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded back. "Figured you'd say that." They found Tyler Voss the next morning behind the gas station on Route 9, sitting alone on an overturned crate, headphones in, shoulders curled forward in the particular posture of a kid trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. When he looked up and saw Daniel Whitfield approaching, flanked by Gary and Ruth Ann, with an old man leaning on Doc's arm trailing behind, something in his face went pale and then hard, the universal teenage armor snapping into place. "I didn't do anything," Tyler said, before anyone had said a word. "Nobody said you did," Daniel replied, keeping his voice level, unhurried, the same tone he'd used on Robert the day before. "We just want to talk." "About what?" The gas station lot smelled of motor oil and wet pavement, and a delivery truck idled somewhere out of sight, its engine a low, steady hum beneath the morning quiet. Tyler pulled one earbud free but kept the other in, a small gesture of resistance, a boy keeping one foot planted in a world where none of them could follow him. Robert stepped forward then, leaning on Doc's steady arm, and looked at the boy, really looked at him, past the defensive posture and the too large jacket to the exhaustion underneath that Robert recognized because he had worn a version of it himself, decades ago, after his own father's accident had rearranged his family's life without warning. "About a cane," Robert said quietly. "My father's cane. I think you might know where it is." Tyler's jaw tightened, and for a moment nobody moved, the whole small parking lot suspended in the particular silence of a truth about to surface or not surface, depending on what happened in the next several seconds. Tyler Voss looked at the ground for a long moment, long enough that Ruth Ann shifted her weight like she meant to fill the silence, and Daniel raised a hand slightly to stop her. "Let it sit," the gesture said. "Let him find his own way to it." "I didn't steal it to keep it," Tyler finally said, voice rough, aimed more at his own sneakers than at any of them. "I pawned it. 15 minutes after I took it. I needed the money." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach, not anger exactly, but the particular grief of learning that something irreplaceable had already changed hands, already been priced and sold, already left his life for good. "Needed it for what?" Gary said, not unkindly, but with the flat directness of a man who had heard 100 excuses in his life and had learned to listen past them for the real one. Tyler's composure cracked slightly at the edges. "My mum's electric got shut off Friday. My dad's, he's not around much anymore. He works doubles most weeks, and when he's not working, he's just gone. And I've got a little sister. She's 9, and it's cold at night now. And I saw that old man's cane just sitting there against the booth, and it looked like real wood, real brass, and I thought—" He stopped, swallowed. "I thought it might be worth something." The parking lot went quiet again, but the quality of the silence had changed, thickened with something none of them had expected to find at the bottom of a simple theft. Somewhere behind the gas station, a dog barked twice and fell silent, and the delivery truck that had been idling finally pulled away, leaving the lot feeling smaller, more exposed, as though the whole conversation had been waiting for privacy before it could continue. Gary shifted his weight, glancing at Daniel, and Robert understood, without being told, that these were men who had learned, likely the hard way, that the loudest problems were rarely the ones sitting on the surface. Ruth Ann's face had gone soft in a way that suggested she was doing arithmetic in her head already, calculating not blame, but need. Robert had spent the last 24 hours building, without quite realizing it, a version of this story in his head. A careless kid, a senseless act, a lesson that needed teaching. He had not built a version where the theft sat on top of a 9-year-old sister and a shut-off notice and a father who had, in his own way, become as absent as if he'd left entirely. "How much did you get for it?" Robert asked, and his voice came out gentler than he expected it to. $40, Tyler said. "Pawn shop on Route 12. I know it's probably worth more than that. I didn't know what else to do." Daniel exchanged a look with Doc, something passing between them that Robert couldn't fully read, some shorthand built from years of riding beside each other, and then Daniel crouched down slightly, bringing himself to something closer to Tyler's eye level, the same gesture he'd used with Robert on the sidewalk the day before. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said. "We're going to go get that cane back, and then we're going to figure out what's actually going on at your house. Because a 9-year-old shouldn't be cold at night in a town where 40 of us would notice if we knew to look." "You don't even know me," Tyler said, and there was something almost accusatory in it, like he was daring them to prove they didn't mean it, bracing for the adults to disappear the way adults in his life apparently tended to. "No," Robert said, surprising himself by speaking before Daniel could. "We don't. but I know what it is to need something and not know how to ask for it without shame getting in the way first." He thought, as he said it, of the 3 years since Eleanor died, of Sundays spent waiting for a phone to ring, of the particular pride that had kept him from calling Carol to say, "I am lonely. I need you to visit more." The plain, honest words he'd never once managed to say out loud. He recognized in this frightened 17-year-old a version of the same stubborn silence that had cost him more comfort than he liked to admit. Doc drove Tyler and Daniel to the pawn shop on Route 12, and Robert waited at the garage with Gary and Ruth Ann, sitting in the same folding chair from the day before, watching the bay door's rectangle of afternoon light shift slowly across the concrete floor. Somewhere in the back, a radio played low, a country station fading in and out of static, and the smell of motor oil had become, over 2 short days, oddly comforting to him, a smell that meant people were near, working, present. Gary brought him a second bottle of water he didn't really need and sat down across from him on an overturned bucket, not saying much, simply keeping him company the way you'd sit with a man in a hospital waiting room, present without demanding conversation in return. Robert found he didn't mind the quiet at all. It was a different kind of quiet than the one waiting for him back at the house on Larchwood Avenue, a quiet with other people breathing inside it. He thought about how close he had come to simply going home the day before, caneless and resigned, chalking the loss up to the ordinary erosions of getting old in a world that moved faster than he did. He thought about how Daniel Whitfield's raised 2 fingers each morning had been, all along, a kind of quiet promise Robert had never bothered to notice he was receiving. When the truck returned 40 minutes later, Daniel carried the cane in himself, the ashwood and brass duckhead handle exactly as Robert remembered it, and behind him, Tyler walked with his hands jammed in his pockets, eyes down but present. He had come back, which Robert understood, even before anyone said it aloud, was its own kind of answer. "Pawn shop owner's a decent guy," Daniel said, handing the cane over. "Gave it back for what Tyler pawned it for. No trouble." Robert took the cane in both hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, the smooth, worn brass under his palm, and for a moment he simply held it, unable to speak. "I'm sorry," Tyler said quietly, still not quite looking up. "I really am. It was a stupid thing to do." "It was a wrong thing to do," Robert corrected gently. "Doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Means you were carrying more than you could hold, and you reached for the wrong thing to set some of it down." Tyler's eyes came up then, surprised, like he'd braced for a lecture and received something else entirely. "So what happens now?" Ruth Ann asked, looking between Robert and Daniel. "About the sister? The electric bill? The father who's never around?" Daniel looked at Robert, and something passed between the 2 men that hadn't been there 24 hours earlier. Not quite friendship yet, but its foundation, laid fast and sturdy the way things sometimes are laid in a single long day when 2 people discover they're building toward the same thing. "Now," Daniel said, "Iron Ridge does what Iron Ridge does." Word moved through Millbrook the way it always did. Not through announcements, but through the diner counter, the hardware store register, the church parking lot on Sunday morning. And by the following week, the story of the stolen cane had transformed into something larger than a single old man and a single struggling family. Patty Kowalski told it to every regular who sat in Robert's old booth, embellishing a little more each time, until the story had taken on the shape of local legend. The old man, the biker, the cane, the kid who'd needed help more than he'd needed punishment. Some people in town still crossed the street when the Iron Ridge riders passed, old habits proving slower to change than any single Tuesday could manage. But Robert noticed, in the weeks that followed, that fewer people did it than before, and those who didn't sometimes lifted a hand in greeting instead, the way you'd greet any neighbor whose name you'd simply never gotten around to learning. Daniel Whitfield did not believe in lectures or headlines. What Iron Ridge Motorcycle Club believed in, as Robert came to understand over the following weeks, was showing up. Gary, it turned out, knew a man at the utility company and made a call that got the Voss family's electric turned back on within the day, with a payment plan quietly arranged rather than a shut-off notice looming. Ruth Ann, who ran a small accounting business out of her house, sat down with Tyler's mother on a Thursday evening and helped her build a budget that didn't collapse under its own weight by the 15th of every month. Doc, who had spent 3 decades patching people back together in ways that had nothing to do with medicine, started picking Tyler's sister up from school on the days their mother worked late, driving her the 6 blocks home in his truck with the windows down and the radio low, because a 9-year-old should never have to walk home in the cold alone while waiting on adults to sort themselves out. And Tyler himself began showing up at the garage 3 afternoons a week, not because anyone had ordered him to, but because Daniel had offered, almost offhandedly, to teach him basic engine work, the kind of skill, Daniel pointed out, that put money in a person's pocket honestly, and put something in a person's hands besides shame. Robert watched all of this unfold from his folding chair at the edge of the garage, which had, without anyone officially deciding it, become his chair, the same way the corner booth at Millie's had once been the entirety of his daily world. He found himself walking to the garage most afternoons now, cane in hand, not because his knee demanded it, but because the walk had somewhere worth arriving. "You've gone and adopted us," Gary told him one evening, only half joking, as the two of them watched Tyler struggle with a stubborn bolt under Daniel's patient direction. "Might be the other way around," Robert said. He thought, often, about the version of the story he might have told himself if things had gone differently. If Daniel Whitfield hadn't crossed that sidewalk, if the cane had simply vanished into whatever pawn shop or dumpster his mind had first imagined, if he'd gone home that Tuesday afternoon and quietly absorbed one more small loss into the widening silence of his house on Larchwood Avenue. It was not hard to imagine, because it was the shape his life had been slowly taking for 3 years, a series of small losses absorbed alone, each one making the next easier to bear only because he was growing accustomed to bearing things alone. What had actually happened instead was harder to explain to Carol when she called that Sunday, though he tried. "You're telling me a motorcycle club found your cane," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice, even through the distance. "I'm telling you," Robert said, "that I have somewhere to be most afternoons now. That doesn't happen to a man my age very often. Somebody ought to write that down somewhere." He did not tell her, because it embarrassed him slightly even now, about the evening 2 weeks after the cane's return, when Daniel had asked him, almost sideways, without making a production of it, whether he'd want an honorary spot at the club's Thursday dinners. Nothing official, no vest, no ceremony, just a standing invitation to a table that had room for one more. Robert had said yes before he'd fully finished hearing the question. The following spring, when Millbrook held its annual town festival on the courthouse lawn, Robert Callahan walked the length of Main Street with his father's cane in one hand, and on the other side of him walked Tyler Voss, 17 years old, wearing a second-hand Iron Ridge jacket, 2 sizes too big, that Gary had given him, with the promise that he'd grow into it. Behind them came Daniel, Ruth Ann, Doc and Gary, 5 motorcycles parked in a neat, gleaming row back at the garage, their engines quiet for the day, but their presence, Robert had come to understand, never really absent from a town that had spent years crossing the street to avoid them. Somewhere along that walk, a young mother pulled her child slightly closer as the group passed, the old habit of caution flickering across her face before she recognized Robert and softened, offering a small wave instead. Robert waved back, cane in hand, and thought about how a single ordinary Tuesday morning, a missing cane, a whispered confession on a sidewalk, had cracked open a silence he hadn't realized he'd built his whole life around, and let something in he hadn't known, until it arrived, how badly he needed. He was 78 years old, and for the first time in 3 years, his world was not shrinking. It was, against every quiet expectation he'd allowed himself, growing wider by the week. That evening, after the festival had wound down and the courthouse lawn had emptied of its folding chairs and lemonade stands, Robert sat on his porch on Larchwood Avenue with the cane resting across his knees, turning the brass duck-head handle slowly under his thumb the way he had 1,000 times before. He thought about his father, who had carried this same weight through his own hard years, and about Eleanor, who would have laughed at all of it. The motorcycles, the folding chair that had become his chair, the 17-year-old who now called him of all things Mr. C. The phone rang inside the house. Carol, a day early for her usual Sunday call, wanting to hear more about the festival, about Tyler, about the club that had somehow become, without either of them quite planning it, an extension of her father's family. Robert rose from the porch chair without needing the cane at all, though he brought it with him anyway, because some things a man carries not from necessity, but from love, and walked inside to answer.